Hello everyone, it's Daniel, your ants enthusiast from South Africa, who is sharing his tips and knowledge on ant keeping. Why do I do this? Simply because YouTube videos taught me a lot, and thus I'd like to return the favor. In this video, you'll see how I connect plastic containers to my test tubes for those growing colonies who need a little more room. I will also perform a little experiment to show you guys the feeding behavior of different ants. The 3 colonies with the most workers will be used in the experiment. However, I have an update that I'd like to share with you all. Large test tube 3 and large test tube 4, who previously housed 2 ant queens, has now been occupied by termite elates. If you missed it, in my last video, when I showed these 2 test tubes, the queens were gone. It seems like they escaped somehow, most likely due to the scare they got from ant workers invading their privacy. While it is sad, something even better came out of their disappearance. These 4 termite elates. I have kept termite elates before, but not unlike the ant queens that previously lived in these test tubes, I had no success. This is because termites are very sensitive to light and vibrations, like ants. However, when disturbed, they simply eat their eggs. This is annoying because it takes you all the way back to square one. Now let's take a deeper look at these interesting insects called termites. Well known for their towering mounds and for invading the wood in your houses, termites are generally disliked, but they are just as fascinating as ants, maybe even more so. They were thought to be related to ants and were actually called white ants, but they have been shown to actually be closely related to cockroaches. Apparently, back in the prehistoric times, there were cockroaches who decided to live underground, eating wood. They then started living as families, which then led to the termites we know today, evolving into what they are now. Their soft bodies are as a result of living underground, away from both the sun as well as predators. They create tunnels and mounds out of a mixture of their saliva or other excretions mixed with soil. Like ants, they live in colonies and make use of pheromones mainly when it comes to communication. Vibrations or sounds are another way they communicate, which they produce by snapping their jaws or hitting them on the ground. For food, they feed on plants and wood, but some species feed off of a fungi, which they grow by feeding plant matter. To digest the normally undigestible wood and plant matter, they have bacteria in their gut that do the job for them. Isn't it just amazing how these creatures live? In terms of keeping termites, I'm probably not the best guy to ask, since I haven't succeeded in getting a colony of them. I just use the same test tube setup that I keep queen ants in. Unlike ants, you need to keep both the male and female, because the female doesn't store sperm in her body like an ant queen does. Instead, she lays unfertilized eggs, which won't grow unless the male fertilizes them himself. Since they cannot be disturbed at all for a long time, I have decided to leave some food in there for them to eat, and for the first workers that appear to eat. This then shows yet another way they are different from ants. Instead of larvae hatching from their eggs, a tiny white termite called a nymph hatches. The nymph then grows as it is fed until it eventually reaches its adult size. Now that the king and queen are all set up for a while, I must resist the temptation to check on them for at least a month. It's not going to be easy. So let's see if I'm successful or not. Now it's time to see how I connect a plastic container to my test tubes. Well, there isn't much to it really. Ideally, I wish I had a proper outworld and container designed specifically for ants, but sometimes you just have to make the most out of what you have. Hopefully one day I will be able to obtain such equipment. The first step is to make a hole in the container for a piece of tubing to go in, as well as an opening in the lid so food can be placed inside. Without the opening, you will have to take the lid off every time you feed and clean the container, which will disturb the colony a bit too much in my opinion. Then you connect the tubing to the test tube, making sure it fits correctly by filling in any spaces. Be careful when you are making holes in the container that there isn't any spaces for the ants, especially the queen, to get out, or they will escape and roam around like mine do. As a hardcore ant enthusiast, I do not mind them wandering around my desk, as I simply watch them explore the various surroundings. It is more interesting than you would expect, honestly. Remember that you must ensure the container you use will be easy to use and make sure to clean it before using it. Depending on how big your ants are, use the appropriate containers. Small ants won't need a huge container, and large ants won't find a small container very interesting. If you decide not to, or you cannot connect the container to the test tube, then simply place the test tube inside a container with the cotton wool that closes it off. This will allow the workers to leave the test tube in search of food and use new dumping sites for their garbage. I plan on using this method for the ants I know cannot scale walls, or else all the ants, including the queen, would just leave. So make sure you use a lid and that you have holes to allow for air to get in. You might also want to consider placing Vaseline or other methods in place on the outside of the container to both ensure your ants don't leave and that any foreign ants don't move in. With that done, my little experiment can now commence. The aim is to determine the behavior of 3 different ant species workers when finding food, while taking into consideration the number of workers of each species as well as how old each colony is. I expect each species to have different behavior when finding food, with some similarities. To test this, I will feed each colony 2 different food items and record their behavior. The food items will be a drop of honey and a freshly killed mealworm. I will also use the same plastic container and tube so as to be consistent with each colony. Let's begin. First, we will look at my largest ant colony. Let's start with the honey. When the tube is connected, the dozens of workers automatically see it as a threat. As a result, it takes a while before any start traveling down the tube into the new container. The honey was placed far away from the ants to try and see how one worker would behave when finding food, instead of the whole colony finding it straight away. Despite there being loads of workers in the test tube, only one of them was really showing interest in the test tube. Eventually they dedicated an area of the container to be their new dumping site, which was rather unexpected. Eventually one worker finds the honey. She drinks it up, most likely collecting as much as she can carry in her. However, it seems as though she doesn't fill her whole stomach before stopping her meal. She then drags the abdomen on the ground while heading back to the test tube, in quite a straight line as well. She then alerts other workers by touching them and bumping around, which causes them to focus on her. She then leads a trail back to the honey, this time with other workers on her trail. Oh, and it looks like another worker found the honey by itself as well. The workers now all begin to feed. Now for the mealworm. The container and tube were cleaned to remove prior trails they may have left on the ground. However, it turned out that the trails were still there and the ants found the mealworm immediately. As a result, the experiment had to be redone to ensure the ants found the mealworm by themselves and not due to trails they left behind already. So let's look instead at how this colony behaves when its workers find food, especially since it will be their first time exploring in a very large new area. Now for the honey. The ants were reluctant at first, carefully inspecting the tube. I adjusted the bridge quickly but ended up scaring the workers. But they soon returned to exploring, and not just one worker either. One worker found the honey and immediately proceeded to drink it up. Another worker found a way out somehow and decided to explore the new environment. The worker who found the honey drank up a lot and then left to tell the others, but could not find her way back. However, she ran into another worker and proceeded to give them some of the honey. Then that worker, along with another, found the honey. The other worker eventually found its way back and fed the other workers, including the queen. However, due to their lack of proper trails, the ants couldn't find the honey so easily. For the last test with honey, let's see how these ants, who also haven't ever explored a very large new area before, behave. Surprisingly, a worker found the honey incredibly fast. Perhaps they were hungrier than I thought. The worker even filled her stomach incredibly full in the first sitting. When finished, just like the previous workers in the other colony, she did not find a clear path back to the test tube and scurried along for quite a while before finding her way back. When she did, the first person she fed was the queen. She then went on to feed the workers. You can clearly see what her abdomen is like, nearly bursting with honey. However, instead of taking other workers with her, she went back to get more honey herself. Before analyzing the results, let's take a look at how each species workers behave when finding a mealworm meal. Once again, we start with the largest colony. One worker did find it, but then seemed to ignore it and continue to travel on. They did find something else interesting, which resulted in workers exploring near the mealworm but leaving it alone. Eventually, one worker started eating the mealworm. The worker then proceeded to drag the mealworm all by itself. When it was close to the tube, another worker started helping it as well. Another worker checked it out but didn't help, and the two workers then pulled the mealworm away and fed on it by themselves. More workers found them, and they attempted once again to move the mealworm and did not succeed, so again they stopped to feed on it. More workers found it, and again they tried to move it, but then stopped to feed yet again. They dropped it and continued feeding, eventually pulling it into the tube and feeding. Moving on to the second colony, who have quite a few workers. Sadly, they completely ignored the mealworm. Instead, they left the container and explored on the table. Perhaps mealworm isn't their favorites. The last colony, with the fewest number of workers, was then observed. The worker found the mealworm and began to eat it by herself. She didn't eat a lot before leaving, running around before finding her way back. After feeding the other workers, she returned to eat more before, once again, heading back while running around in circles. The other workers didn't go and eat for themselves, but only got fed by this one worker. To conclude the experiment, the different species did have different feeding behaviors. For the honey, the largest colony was very structured and organized, leaving a set trail for others to find the food, whereas the second colony wasn't organized and the workers found the honey by chance later on. The last colony relied only on the one worker, who, unlike the other two species, ate her full before leaving. When looking at the mealworms, the largest colony carried the mealworm off, the second colony didn't even eat it, and the third colony once again relied on the one worker to collect the food. The behavior of the workers when finding food in general was that the worker would eat the food herself, trying to hold as much as she can in her stomach. This is most probably because in the wild there is competition for food, and if the worker does not eat any food she finds, then she might not get a chance later as other ants might find it. The younger colony struggled with alerting the other workers, and this is probably because they have not traveled around in search of food before, so they have no experience. Perhaps if the experiment is done when all the colonies are older and I'll have better equipment, I could see how the results change. And that's it for today's video, guys. Thank you all for watching. Leave a comment below saying what you would like to see in future videos. Next week, I'll be showing you all my ant queens and how their colonies are growing, as well as move my largest ant colony into an ant farm, showing you how I do it. See you then. Peace out.